Margaret Thompson had served the royal family for 37 years. She started as a young woman of 22, fresh from a small village in Scotland, with dreams of working in the grandest household in all of Britain. Now at 59, she walked the corridors of Windsor Castle with the confidence of someone who knew every secret passage, every hidden door, and every whispered conversation that echoed through these ancient walls. Her uniform was always perfectly pressed, her silver hair neatly pinned beneath her cap, and her shoes polished to a mirror shine. Margaret took pride in her work as the head of royal wardrobe management. She had dressed 3 generations of royals, from the late Queen's mother to the current generation of princes and princesses. Her hands had touched silk that cost more than most people earned in a year, and she had been trusted with jewels that could buy entire cities. But today felt different. Today, Margaret's heart carried a weight that made each step feel heavier than usual. She clutched a brass key in her weathered hand, the metal warming against her palm as she made her way toward the Royal Wardrobe Archive. This particular room held the most precious garments in the royal collection, pieces that told the story of British monarchy through fabric and thread. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Margaret had received specific instructions from Queen Camilla's private secretary the evening before. The Queen Consort required access to a particular dress from the archive, one that had not been worn for decades. Margaret knew exactly which dress they meant, and the thought of it made her stomach twist with unease. As she approached the heavy oak door of the archive, Margaret paused. She could hear her own heartbeat in the silence. Behind this door lay hundreds of gowns, each with its own story, its own memories woven into the very fabric. There were coronation robes, state dinner gowns, and casual day dresses that had graced garden parties. But among all these treasures, one dress stood apart from the rest. Margaret inserted the key into the lock and turned it slowly. The door opened with a soft creak, releasing the familiar scent of lavender sachets and old silk. She stepped inside and pulled the chain of an overhead light. The room came alive with color and shimmer. Rows upon rows of garments hung in perfect order, each protected by white cotton covers. She walked deeper into the room, past evening gowns that had danced at state balls, past riding habits that had galloped through Scottish highlands, past coats that had weathered bitter London winters. Her destination lay at the very back of the archive in a section that was rarely disturbed. Here, behind a velvet rope, hung the most sacred garments of all. Margaret's eyes found it immediately. Even covered in protective cloth, she could recognize its silhouette. This was the dress that had changed everything. The dress that had made a shy young woman into a beloved queen. It was Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress, the gown she had worn on November 20th, 1947, when she married Prince Philip and began a love story that would span over 70 years. The dress was a masterpiece of post-war Britain. Designed by Norman Hartnell, it had been created during a time when fabric was still rationed from the war. Every pearl, every crystal, every thread had been carefully chosen and painstakingly sewn by hand. The ivory silk satin gleamed even in the dim light, and the 15-foot train had once swept down the aisle of Westminster Abbey, witnessed by millions around the world. Margaret approached the dress slowly, as if it were a sleeping giant that might wake at any moment. She had been present when the young Princess Elizabeth had first tried it on. She remembered the girl's nervous laughter, the way her eyes had sparkled with excitement and terror in equal measure. Margaret had been the one to adjust the final button, to smooth the train, to place the glittering tiara upon the future queen's head. Now, decades later, that same dress was to be worn again. Queen Camilla had requested it for an upcoming state dinner, a celebration marking a significant anniversary of British-French relations. The official reason was tradition, honoring the legacy of the late queen by incorporating elements of her most iconic looks into modern royal occasions. But Margaret knew better. She had seen the way people looked at Queen Camilla, the whispers that followed her through public appearances. Some still questioned her right to wear the crown, still compared her to Diana, still wondered if she truly deserved to stand where Elizabeth had stood for so many years. This dress was meant to be a statement, a claim to legitimacy wrapped in silk and pearls. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for the protective covering. She had dressed royals for nearly 4 decades, but she had never felt this conflicted about her duties. This dress wasn't just fabric and thread. It was history, It was love. It was the physical embodiment of a promise made between two young people who had no idea they would become the most beloved royal couple in British history. As she slowly pulled away the cotton cover, the dress revealed itself in all its glory. The intricate beadwork caught the light, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the walls. The bodice was fitted and elegant, designed to transform any woman into a vision of grace and dignity. The skirt fell in perfect folds, each pleat carefully planned to create the most flattering silhouette possible. Margaret found herself remembering the last time she had seen Queen Elizabeth in this dress. It had been years ago during a private family celebration. The elderly queen had asked to try it on one more time just to see if it still fit. Margaret had helped her into it, watching as decades melted away from the monarch's face. For just a moment she had been that young bride again, full of hope and dreams. Now someone else would wear this sacred garment, someone who had not earned it through 7 decades of service, through personal sacrifice, through the kind of unwavering dedication that had made Elizabeth a legend. Margaret stood alone in the archive, staring at the dress, knowing that once it left this room, something precious would be lost forever. The brass key felt heavy in her pocket as she made her decision. Some things were too important to be treated as mere costumes. Some traditions were too sacred to be used as political statements. Margaret Thompson had served the royal family faithfully for 37 years, but today, for the first time in her career, she was going to say no. The telephone in Margaret's small office rang at precisely 9 o'clock the next morning. She had been expecting the call, but her heart still jumped when she heard the crisp voice of Lady Catherine Pemberton, Queen Camilla's private secretary. Lady Pemberton was known throughout the palace for her efficiency and her complete lack of tolerance for delays or excuses. "Miss Thompson?" Lady Pemberton's voice carried the authority of someone who spoke directly for the Queen Consort. "Her Majesty is expecting the dress to be delivered to her private dressing room by 11 o'clock this morning. The final fitting has been scheduled for this afternoon." Margaret gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind a dozen times during the sleepless night, but now that the moment had arrived, her carefully planned words seemed to dissolve on her tongue. "Lady Pemberton," Margaret began, her Scottish accent becoming more pronounced as it always did when she was nervous. "I'm afraid there's been a complication with the dress." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Margaret could almost feel Lady Pemberton's disapproval radiating through the telephone wires. What sort of complication? The question was sharp, cutting through Margaret's hesitation like a blade. Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "The dress is not suitable for wearing, ma'am. Upon closer inspection, I've discovered that the fabric has become too fragile for use. The preservation methods of the 1940s were not as advanced as today's standards, and I'm concerned that any stress on the garment could cause irreparable damage." It was not entirely a lie. The dress was indeed delicate, as any 75-year-old garment would be. But Margaret had examined it thoroughly, and while it required careful handling, it was still structurally sound. She had seen far more fragile gowns worn successfully at state occasions. "Miss Thompson?" Lady Pemberton's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. "Are you telling me that you are unable to fulfill a direct request from Her Majesty the Queen?" The words hung in the air like a threat. Margaret understood the implications perfectly. In the rigid hierarchy of royal service, refusing a direct order from the Queen Consort was tantamount to professional suicide. She could lose not only her job, but also her grace and favor apartment in the castle grounds, her pension, and her reputation in the only world she had ever known. "I am telling you," Margaret said, finding strength in her voice that surprised even herself, "that as head of royal wardrobe management, I have a professional duty to protect the garments in my care. Allowing this dress to be worn would be a betrayal of that trust." She could hear Lady Pemberton's sharp intake of breath. "Miss Thompson, I suggest you reconsider your position very carefully. Her Majesty does not appreciate being told that her requests cannot be accommodated." The line went dead, leaving Margaret staring at the phone in her hand. She set it down carefully and looked around her small office. The walls were covered with photographs spanning her entire career. Herself with the late Queen Mother, standing beside Princess Diana on her wedding day, helping to arrange the Queen's coronation gown for a museum exhibition. These pictures told the story of a lifetime dedicated to service, and now she was risking it all for a principle that some might call foolish. Margaret walked to her filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder labeled Queen Elizabeth II Wedding Ensemble. Inside were detailed photographs, fabric samples, and preservation notes spanning decades. She had been the primary caretaker of this dress for the last 15 years, ever since her predecessor had retired. She knew every bead, every stitch, every place where time had left its gentle mark. As she flipped through the documentation, Margaret remembered the conversation she had overheard just 2 weeks earlier. She had been working late in the archive when she heard voices in the corridor outside. Queen Camilla had been speaking with her stylist, a fashionable woman from London who specialized in making royals look modern and relevant. "The symbolism will be perfect," the stylist had said. "Wearing Elizabeth's wedding dress sends a clear message that you are not just Charles's wife, but the rightful heir to Elizabeth's legacy. It positions you as the continuation of her reign rather than a replacement." Margaret had frozen at those words. The idea that Queen Elizabeth's most personal and sacred garment would be used as a political prop had filled her with a cold rage that she was still feeling now. Around noon, Margaret's assistant knocked on her door. Jenny was a sweet girl from Wales, barely 23 years old, who looked up to Margaret with the kind of hero worship that made the older woman both proud and protective. "Miss Thompson," Jenny whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder, "Lady Pemberton has been asking questions about you. She's been speaking with other department heads, asking about your work performance, your reliability, whether you've ever refused orders before." Margaret nodded grimly. She had expected this. Lady Pemberton was building a case, gathering ammunition to use against her when the inevitable confrontation came. "Jenny," Margaret said quietly, "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it without asking questions. Can you manage that?" The young woman nodded eagerly, her eyes wide with curiosity and concern. "I need you to contact the Royal Archives and request the complete documentation for Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress. Tell them it's for a routine condition assessment. Then I need you to compile a report on the current preservation protocols for garments of historical significance." Jenny looked confused but nodded. "Should I mark it as urgent?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Very urgent." As Jenny hurried away to complete her tasks, Margaret turned back to her photographs. She picked up one that showed her helping the late Queen prepare for her Diamond Jubilee celebrations. Elizabeth had been in her 80s then, but her eyes had still sparkled with the same joy Margaret remembered from her wedding day. The Queen had trusted Margaret with her most precious possessions, had relied on her expertise and discretion for decades. Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had never called before, a number that connected directly to the office of the King himself. She was about to break every rule of royal protocol, but some things were more important than rules. "Your Majesty's office," came the polite voice of the King's private secretary. "This is Margaret Thompson, head of Royal Wardrobe Management," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I need to speak with His Majesty about a matter of utmost importance regarding his late mother's personal effects." King Charles received Margaret in his private study at 2 o'clock that afternoon. The room was filled with paintings of landscapes and horses, books stacked on every available surface, and the gentle scent of the Earl Grey tea that always seemed to follow him. Margaret had only been in this room twice before in all her years of service, and both times had been for formal presentations of new acquisitions to the royal wardrobe. The King sat behind an antique mahogany desk, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed what appeared to be official state papers. When Margaret was announced, he looked up with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Charles had always been different from his mother in his approach to staff. Where Elizabeth had maintained a kind but formal distance, Charles was more likely to engage in actual conversation, to ask about families and personal concerns. "Miss Thompson," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk, "please sit down. I understand you have something important to discuss regarding my mother's belongings." Margaret had prepared for this moment, but sitting across from the King of England made her rehearsed words feel inadequate. She clasped her hands in her lap and tried to find the courage that had carried her through the morning's confrontation with Lady Pemberton. "Your Majesty," she began, "I have served your family for 37 years. In all that time, I have never refused a direct order or failed to carry out my duties to the best of my ability." Charles nodded, his expression encouraging her to continue. "However, I find myself in a position where I must respectfully object to a request that has been made regarding your mother's wedding dress." The king's eyebrows rose slightly. Margaret could see that he was not entirely surprised by this news, which suggested that word of the morning's conflict had already reached his ears through the palace's efficient gossip network. "I see," Charles said carefully. "And what is the nature of your objection?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Your Majesty, your mother's wedding dress is not simply a garment. It is a piece of British history, a symbol of the love story that sustained the monarchy for over 70 years. To use it as a costume for political purposes would be a desecration of everything it represents." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret realized she had just criticized the Queen Consort's intentions in front of her husband, a breach of protocol so severe that it could be considered treason in earlier centuries. Charles was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently against the desk surface. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than angry. "Miss Thompson, you obviously feel very strongly about this matter. Can you help me understand why you believe my wife's intentions are inappropriate?" Margaret felt a flush of relief that he was willing to listen rather than simply dismiss her concerns. She leaned forward slightly, her passion for her work overriding her nervousness. "Your Majesty, I was there when your mother first tried on that dress. I watched her transform from a nervous young woman into a radiant bride. I've cared for that dress through 7 decades, watching it age gracefully, preserving it for future generations. It's not just fabric and beads. It's the physical embodiment of your parents' love story." Charles's expression softened at the mention of his parents. Margaret knew she had touched on something deeply personal. Every time your mother wore that dress in later years, for anniversary photographs or private family moments, she became that young bride again. The dress holds the memory of the happiest day of her life. The day she promised to love your father until death parted them. To use it now for political symbolism would be like turning Westminster Abbey into a shopping center. The king stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where his mother had spent countless peaceful hours. Margaret waited, knowing that she had said everything she could say. "Miss Thompson," Charles said finally, still facing the window, "my wife believes that wearing my mother's dress would honor her memory and show continuity between reigns." "With respect." "Your Majesty," Margaret replied, "your mother's memory needs no borrowed glory. Her legacy stands on its own merits. The dress should be preserved as she left it, as a testament to what she achieved, not altered to serve current political needs." Charles turned back to face her, and Margaret was surprised to see something that looked like relief in his eyes. "You know," he said quietly, "my mother often spoke of you in the final years. She said you were one of the few people who truly understood what her belongings meant to her, who saw them as more than mere objects." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected revelation. She also said, Charles continued, that she hoped when she was gone, there would still be people willing to protect what mattered, even when it was difficult. Before Margaret could respond, there was a sharp knock on the study door. Charles called for the visitor to enter, and Lady Pemberton swept into the room with the bearing of someone accustomed to getting her way in all matters. "Your Majesty," Lady Pemberton said, barely acknowledging Margaret's presence, "I apologize for the interruption, but there seems to be some confusion regarding preparations for tonight's dinner. Her Majesty is expecting the dress to be ready for her final fitting, but Miss Thompson appears to be experiencing difficulties with her duties." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Margaret could feel the weight of both their gazes upon her, and she realized that this moment would define the rest of her career, possibly the rest of her life. Charles looked from Lady Pemberton to Margaret and back again. "Lady Pemberton, I believe there may have been a misunderstanding about which dress my wife intended to wear." Lady Pemberton's perfectly composed expression flickered with confusion. "Your Majesty, Miss Thompson has brought to my attention some concerns about the condition of my mother's wedding dress. Upon reflection, I think it would be more appropriate for my wife to choose something from her own collection for this evening's dinner." The words were spoken gently, but Margaret could hear the steel beneath them. This was not a suggestion. It was a royal command. Lady Pemberton's face went through several rapid changes of expression before settling on polite acceptance. "Of course, Your Majesty. I'm sure Her Majesty will understand completely But Margaret could see the fury burning in the woman's eyes, and she knew that this victory would come with a price. Lady Pemberton was not someone who forgot or forgave challenges to her authority. The confrontation with Queen Camilla came 3 days later, and it was far more intense than Margaret had anticipated. She had been summoned to the Queen Consort's private apartments at precisely 10 o'clock on a gray Thursday morning. The invitation had come through official channels, written on heavy cream paper with the royal seal, but Margaret knew this was not going to be a pleasant social call. Queen Camilla's private sitting room was decorated in soft blues and yellows, with comfortable chairs arranged around a fireplace that crackled warmly, despite the autumn chill outside. Fresh flowers filled crystal vases and morning light streamed through tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a welcoming space. But today, the atmosphere felt charged with tension. The Queen Consort stood with her back to the door when Margaret was announced, apparently studying a painting on the far wall. She was dressed in a navy blue suit that Margaret recognized as one of her favorites, perfectly tailored and accessorized with a pearl necklace that caught the light beautifully. When she turned to face Margaret, her expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes held a coldness that made Margaret's stomach clench with nervousness. "Miss Thompson," Queen Camilla said, her voice level and controlled. "Please take a seat." Margaret sat in the chair indicated, keeping her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. She had dressed with extra care this morning, choosing her most formal uniform and ensuring every detail was perfect. If this was to be her last official meeting as head of Royal Wardrobe Management, she was determined to maintain her dignity. "I understand," Queen Camilla continued, moving to sit across from Margaret, "that you have some concerns about my request to wear the late Queen's wedding dress." The words were spoken politely, but Margaret could hear the underlying anger. This was a woman who was accustomed to having her wishes fulfilled without question or delay. "Your Majesty," Margaret replied carefully, "my primary concern is the preservation of historically significant garments in the royal collection." Queen Camilla smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Miss Thompson, let me be very clear about something. I am not some temporary visitor to this family. I am the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom, and I have every right to wear any garment in the royal wardrobe that I choose." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Your Majesty has every legal right to make such requests," Margaret agreed. "However, as the professional responsible for these garments, I also have a duty to advise when such requests might compromise the integrity of irreplaceable historical artifacts." Queen Camilla leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Are you suggesting that I would somehow damage or disrespect the dress?" Margaret chose her words very carefully. "Your Majesty, the dress is 75 years old. While it has been carefully preserved, it was never intended to be worn regularly. Each time it is worn, it suffers microscopic damage that accumulates over time. Given its historical significance, I believe it should be reserved for only the most exceptional occasions." "And you do not consider a state dinner honoring Franco-British relations to be sufficiently exceptional?" The question was a trap, and Margaret knew it. Any answer she gave could be twisted to make her appear either disrespectful to the event or presumptuous in her judgment of royal priorities. "Your Majesty," Margaret said slowly, "I believe that your own gowns, chosen specifically for your reign and your personal style, would make a far more powerful statement about the future of the monarchy than wearing garments from the past." Queen Camilla stood abruptly and walked to the window, her movements sharp with controlled anger. When she spoke again, her voice carried the full weight of her position. "Miss Thompson, I think there is something you need to understand. There are people in this country, in this very palace, who still question my right to be here. They whisper about my past. They compare me unfavorably to others. They suggest that I am somehow unworthy of the crown I wear." Margaret said nothing, but she felt a chill run down her spine. This conversation was moving into dangerous territory. "Wearing Elizabeth's wedding dress," Queen Camilla continued, still facing the window, "would send a clear message that I am not an interloper or a replacement, but a continuation of the royal tradition. It would show that I am worthy of wearing the same garments that she wore, that I have earned my place in the line of queens who have served this nation." The honesty of the statement caught Margaret off guard. For the first time, she glimpsed the insecurity and vulnerability that lay beneath Queen Camilla's composed exterior. But understanding the motivation did not change Margaret's fundamental objection. "Your Majesty," Margaret said gently, "may I speak frankly?" Queen Camilla turned back to face her, nodding slightly. "Your worth as queen consort will never be determined by what dress you wear to a dinner party. Queen Elizabeth's legacy is secure, and it needs no borrowed glory. Your own legacy must be built on your own achievements, your own choices, your own character. Wearing her wedding dress will not make you more legitimate in the eyes of your critics, and it is unnecessary for those who already support you." The silence that followed was so complete that Margaret could hear the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Queen Camilla's face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked like grudging respect. "You are very bold, Miss Thompson, to lecture a queen on matters of legitimacy and legacy. Your Majesty, I have served 3 generations of this family. I have seen queens rise and fall in public opinion based not on what they wore, but on what they did. Your predecessor earned her place in history through 7 decades of unwavering service, not through her wardrobe." Queen Camilla returned to her chair, studying Margaret with new interest. "And what would you suggest I wear instead?" Margaret felt a surge of hope. Perhaps this confrontation could end with compromise rather than conflict. "Your Majesty has an extensive collection of beautiful gowns, many of which have never been worn to public events. There is a particular piece by Bruce Oldfield, a deep blue silk with silver embroidery that would be perfect for this occasion. It is elegant, sophisticated, and entirely your own." Queen Camilla considered this for a moment. "The blue silk you mentioned? It was a gift from Charles for our first wedding anniversary." "Yes, Your Majesty. It tells the story of your own marriage, your own love story, rather than borrowing from someone else's." For the first time since Margaret had entered the room, Queen Camilla's expression softened slightly. "You make a compelling argument, Miss Thompson, but I hope you understand that by refusing my initial request, you have created a very difficult situation." The news of Margaret's defiance spread through the palace like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations in servants' corridors and meaningful glances exchanged during staff meetings. By the end of the week, everyone from the kitchen, maids to the senior courtiers, knew that the head of royal wardrobe management had dared to refuse a direct request from the Queen. Consort Margaret found herself walking through a minefield of divided loyalties. Some of the older staff members, particularly those who had served Queen Elizabeth for decades, approached her with quiet words of support. Mrs. Henderson from the housekeeping staff stopped her in the corridor to whisper that she had done the right thing, that some things were too sacred to be treated as costume pieces. James, the elderly footman who had served the royal family for 43 years, gave her a subtle nod of approval when their paths crossed in the servants' hall, but others treated her with a coldness that cut deeper than outright hostility. Lady Pemberton's allies in the administrative staff began finding fault with every aspect of Margaret's work. Requisition forms that had been processed routinely for years were suddenly returned with demands for additional documentation. Meetings were scheduled at times that conflicted with Margaret's other duties. Then criticism was leveled when she could not attend. The pressure was subtle but relentless, designed to make her position untenable. Jenny, her young assistant, became Margaret's lifeline during this difficult period. The girl's loyalty never wavered, even as she fielded increasingly hostile inquiries from other departments. She worked overtime to ensure that every aspect of their wardrobe management duties was executed flawlessly, leaving no room for legitimate criticism. "Miss Thompson," Jenny said one afternoon as they catalogued new acquisitions in the archive room, "I heard something troubling today." Margaret looked up from the inventory sheet she was updating. "What did you hear?" Lady Pemberton was speaking with the Human Resources Director. "I couldn't hear everything, but I heard them mention performance review and possible restructuring of the wardrobe department." Margaret's heart sank, though she tried not to let her dismay show on her face. She had expected retaliation, but she had hoped it would be less systematic. "Jenny," she said carefully, "I want you to know that whatever happens to me, your position here is secure. You've done nothing wrong and you're a valuable member of the staff." The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "But it's not fair. You were protecting something important, something that mattered to the late Queen. How can they punish you for that?" Margaret set down her pen and looked at her assistant with affection. "My dear girl, fairness is a luxury that people in our position cannot always afford. We serve at the pleasure of the royal family, and sometimes that service requires sacrifices. But Margaret was not prepared to go quietly. That evening, she made a decision that would change everything. She retrieved a small key from her personal jewelry box and used it to open a locked drawer in her bedroom dresser. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a collection of letters written in Queen Elizabeth's distinctive handwriting. These letters had been given to Margaret over the years. Small notes of appreciation for her service, personal messages that revealed the late Queen's thoughts about her wardrobe and the significance of various pieces. Margaret had treasured these letters as tokens of trust and friendship, never imagining that she might one day need them as evidence. She spread the letters across her small dining table and began to read through them systematically. In one dated just 3 years earlier, Queen Elizabeth had written about her wedding dress specifically. "My dear Margaret, I wanted to thank you personally for the beautiful condition in which you maintain my wedding gown. Every time I see it, I'm transported back to that wonderful day when Philip and I began our journey together. I hope that future generations will be able to see it exactly as it was when I wore it, a testament to the love that sustained us through 70 years of marriage. Your careful stewardship means more to me than you could ever know." Another letter, written during the Queen's final Christmas, contained an even more telling passage. "I have been thinking lately about the legacy I will leave behind, particularly the personal items that will outlive me. I trust that you will continue to protect the things that matter most, even when others might not understand their true significance. Sometimes the greatest service we can provide is saying no to the wrong requests, even when it would be easier to say yes." Margaret stared at these words for a long time, feeling as though Queen Elizabeth were speaking to her directly from beyond the grave. The late Queen had known that difficult decisions lay ahead, and she had trusted Margaret to make them correctly. The next morning, Margaret made copies of the relevant letters and sealed them in an envelope addressed to King Charles. She included a cover letter explaining her position and requesting a formal audience to discuss the matter further. She knew this was an enormous risk. Going over the head of the Queen Consort could be seen as an act of rebellion that warranted immediate dismissal. But before she could send the package, an unexpected visitor arrived at her office. Princess Anne, the King's sister, appeared at Margaret's door without any advance notice, dressed in her typical no-nonsense manner, and wearing an expression that suggested she had something important to discuss. "Miss Thompson?" the princess said briskly, closing the door behind her. "I believe we need to talk." Margaret jumped to her feet, startled by this unprecedented visit. Princess Anne had always been known for her direct approach and her lack of patience for protocol when important matters were at stake. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret stammered. "Please take a seat." "I'll stand, thank you," Princess Anne replied. "What I have to say won't take long. I understand there has been some controversy regarding my mother's wedding dress." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "Yes, Your Royal Highness. I also understand that you have refused to allow it to be worn for political purposes. I have advised against it on preservation grounds." "Your Royal Highness." Princess Anne's stern expression suddenly broke into what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Miss Thompson, you should know that my mother specifically mentioned you in her final instructions regarding her personal effects. She was quite clear that certain items should never be treated as mere costumes." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes.
"Your Royal Highness?"
"My mother knew that pressure would be applied to use her most treasured possessions for purposes she would not have approved. She trusted you to stand firm against such pressure, even when it became personally costly." Princess Anne moved closer to Margaret's desk, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. "She also left specific instructions about what should happen if anyone attempted to override your professional judgment in matters concerning her wedding dress." Margaret could hardly breathe. "What instructions, Your Royal Highness?" "The dress is to be permanently retired from active use and placed in a special exhibition at Windsor Castle, where it can be viewed by the public but never worn again." The decision was made final before her death, but the paperwork was delayed in implementation. The princess reached into her handbag and withdrew an official-looking document bearing Queen Elizabeth's signature and seal. "Consider this your authorization to proceed with those instructions, effective immediately." The implementation of Queen Elizabeth's final wishes regarding her wedding dress created an earthquake throughout the palace hierarchy. Margaret found herself at the center of a storm that reached far beyond the wardrobe department, touching every level of royal administration and protocol. Lady Pemberton's reaction was swift and furious. Within hours of Princess Anne's visit, Margaret received a summons to appear before an emergency meeting of the Senior Staff Council. The council consisted of the heads of all major palace departments, and it was rarely convened except for matters of the utmost gravity. Margaret had never appeared before this body in all her years of service. The meeting was held in the Oak Room, a formal space lined with portraits of former monarchs and furnished with a massive table that had witnessed centuries of important decisions. When Margaret entered, she found 12 stern faces staring at her across the polished wood surface. Lady Pemberton sat at the head of the table, flanked by the master of the household, the keeper of the privy purse, and other senior officials whose approval was essential for her continued employment. "Miss Thompson," Lady Pemberton began, her voice carrying the weight of official displeasure, "this council has been convened to address what appears to be a serious breach of protocol and insubordination within the wardrobe department." Margaret remained standing, as protocol required, her hands clasped behind her back in the military posture she had learned during her first weeks of royal service, decades earlier. "It has come to our attention," Lady Pemberton continued, "that you have not only refused direct instructions from Her Majesty the Queen Consort, but have also circumvented proper channels by appealing directly to other members of the royal family." The master of the household, a portly man named Sir Geoffrey Worthington, leaned forward with a disapproving frown. "Miss Thompson, the proper chain of command exists for very important reasons. When staff members begin making independent decisions about what orders they will or will not follow, it undermines the entire structure of royal service." Margaret felt her heart pounding, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Sir Geoffrey, with respect, I have followed the proper procedures for protecting historically significant artifacts in the royal collection. My actions have been entirely consistent with established preservation protocols." "Preservation protocols," Lady Pemberton said coldly, "do not supersede direct royal commands. You seem to have forgotten your place in this hierarchy, Miss Thompson." The keeper of the privy purse, a sharp-eyed woman named Dame Elizabeth Hartwell, shuffled through some papers before speaking. "Miss Thompson, we have reviewed your employment file, and while your work has generally been satisfactory, there have been concerns raised about your judgment and your willingness to cooperate with necessary changes in royal protocol." Margaret realized that this was a carefully orchestrated attack, designed to build a case for her dismissal that would seem reasonable and justified to outside observers. The council members had already made their decision before she entered the room. Furthermore, Dame Elizabeth continued, "It has been suggested that your long tenure in this position may have led to an inappropriate sense of ownership over items that belong to the crown, not to individual staff members." The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be effective. Margaret did feel a deep personal connection to the garments in her care, particularly those that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth. But that connection had always motivated her to provide better service, not to claim ownership. Before Margaret could respond, the door to the Oak Room opened, and Princess Anne entered without ceremony.
The entire council rose to their feet in surprise.
As royal family members did not typically attend staff disciplinary meetings. "Please, sit down," Princess Anne said briskly, taking a seat at the opposite end of the table from Lady Pemberton. "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe there has been a misunderstanding about Miss Thompson's recent actions." Lady Pemberton's face had gone pale, but she managed to maintain her composure. "Your Royal Highness, this is a routine administrative matter that does not require royal involvement." "On the contrary," Princess Anne replied, "this matter involves the implementation of my late mother's specific wishes regarding her personal effects. I would hardly call that routine." She placed the document bearing Queen Elizabeth's signature on the table where everyone could see it. Miss Thompson was not acting independently or insubordinately. She was carrying out direct instructions from the late Queen, instructions that supersede any subsequent requests. The silence in the room was deafening. Margaret could see the council members exchanging glances, recalculating their positions in light of this new information. Sir Geoffrey cleared his throat nervously. "Your Royal Highness, we were not aware of any such instructions. The implementation was delayed due to the period of mourning and the complexity of the transition," Princess Anne explained. "However, the instructions were quite clear. My mother was very specific about which of her personal items should be preserved for historical display, and which could continue to be used for official purposes. Dame Elizabeth leaned forward. "Your Royal Highness, what does this mean for the wardrobe department's operations going forward?" "It means," Princess Anne said firmly, "that Miss Thompson has been doing exactly what she was supposed to do. Her professional judgment and her loyalty to my mother's wishes have been exemplary." Lady Pemberton's mask of professional composure finally slipped, revealing the frustration and anger beneath. "Your Royal Highness, surely you understand that certain adaptations must be made to accommodate the current Queen Consort's needs and preferences." Princess Anne's expression hardened. "Lady Pemberton, my mother's legacy is not subject to adaptation based on anyone's preferences. Miss Thompson understands this, which is why she has my complete support." The meeting ended abruptly after that, with the council members filing out in uncomfortable silence. Margaret found herself alone with Princess Anne, who studied her with the same direct gaze that had intimidated politicians and diplomats for decades. "Miss Thompson," the princess said quietly, "you should know that this is far from over. There will be other attempts to undermine your position, other ways of pressuring you to compromise your principles." Margaret nodded, understanding the warning implicit in the words. "However," Princess Anne continued, "you should also know that you are not alone in this fight. My mother chose you for this responsibility because she trusted you to do what was right, even when it was difficult. That trust was well placed." As Princess Anne prepared to leave, she turned back with one final piece of advice. "Miss Thompson, document everything. Keep records of every conversation, every request, every attempt to pressure you. You may need that evidence before this is finished." Margaret spent that evening in her small apartment, writing detailed notes about every interaction she had experienced since the original request for Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress. She had the feeling that Princess Anne's warning was about to prove prophetic, and she wanted to be prepared for whatever came next. Outside her window, the lights of Windsor Castle glowed against the darkening sky, and Margaret thought about all the secrets these ancient walls had witnessed over the centuries. Her own small drama was just one more thread in the complex tapestry of royal history, but she was determined to ensure it was a thread that honored the memory of the woman who had trusted her with so much. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the newly opened Queen Elizabeth Memorial Exhibition at Windsor Castle, watching visitors from around the world gaze in wonder at the wedding dress that had caused so much controversy. The gown was displayed in a climate-controlled case, illuminated by special lighting that revealed every detail of its exquisite craftsmanship, while protecting the delicate fabric from damage. The exhibition had become one of the most popular attractions in the castle's history. Thousands of people came each week to see the dress that had transformed a young princess into a beloved queen, to read the story of the love affair that had sustained the British monarchy through its most challenging decades. Children pressed their faces against the glass, asking their parents about the tiny pearls and crystals that sparkled like stars against the ivory silk. Margaret had been appointed as the exhibition's chief curator, a role that allowed her to share her deep knowledge of Queen Elizabeth's wardrobe with scholars and visitors alike. It was a position that carried significant prestige and had effectively ended the whispered campaign against her job security. The transformation in her circumstances had come about gradually, as the wisdom of preserving the dress became apparent to even her harshest critics. The exhibition generated substantial revenue for the Royal Collection Trust, attracted positive media attention to the monarchy, and provided a tangible way for the public to connect with Queen Elizabeth's memory. What had initially been seen as Margaret's stubborn defiance was now viewed as prescient preservation of an invaluable cultural artifact. Queen Camilla had eventually chosen the blue, Bruce Oldfield gown for the Franco-British state dinner, and the photographs from that evening had been spectacular. The dress had been perfect for her coloring and figure, and the media coverage had focused on her elegance and style rather than any controversial symbolic choices. Several fashion magazines had featured articles about her sophisticated taste in evening wear, marking a turning point in her public image. More importantly, the Queen Consort had quietly visited the exhibition on several occasions, always during private hours when she could view the dress without public attention. Margaret had been present during one of these visits and had watched as Queen Camilla stood before the display case for nearly 20 minutes, studying every detail of the gown. "It really is extraordinary," Queen Camilla had said finally, her voice soft with genuine admiration. I can see why my mother-in-law treasured it so much. The use of the phrase "my mother-in-law" rather than the late Queen had struck Margaret as significant. It suggested a more personal understanding of what the dress represented, a recognition that some things transcended political considerations. "Your Majesty," Margaret had replied carefully, "I hope you understand that my objections were never personal. I simply believed that the dress could serve the monarchy better as a preserved artifact than as an active garment." Queen Camilla had nodded thoughtfully. "Miss Thompson, I have come to realize that you were absolutely right. This dress tells a more powerful story here than it ever could have at a dinner party." The reconciliation between them had been gradual, but genuine. Queen Camilla had begun consulting Margaret about other historically significant pieces in the royal wardrobe, seeking her expertise on preservation and display. Margaret had helped curate several smaller exhibitions, featuring the Queen Consort's own growing collection of important gowns, ensuring that future generations would be able to appreciate the fashion choices that defined her reign. Lady Pemberton had been transferred to another position within the royal household, officially described as a promotion, but understood by everyone as a lateral move that removed her from direct authority over preservation decisions. The new private secretary, Lady Sarah Whitmore, had a background in museum studies and immediately understood the importance of balancing royal needs with historical preservation. On this particular morning, as Margaret made her final rounds through the exhibition before opening time, she encountered Jenny arranging fresh flowers near the information desk. The young woman had been promoted to assistant curator and was pursuing additional training in textile preservation at Margaret's encouragement. "Miss Thompson," Jenny said with a smile, "there's a letter for you from Buckingham Palace. It looks quite official." Margaret accepted the heavy envelope with curiosity. The return address indicated it came from the King's private office, and the weight suggested something more substantial than routine correspondence. Inside, she found a formal invitation to receive the Royal Victorian Medal, an honor bestowed personally by the monarch for distinguished service to the royal family. The citation read, "In recognition of exceptional dedication to the preservation of royal heritage and unwavering commitment to the highest standards of curatorial excellence." Margaret stared at the invitation for several minutes, overwhelmed by the recognition. The Royal Victorian Medal was not given lightly. It represented acknowledgement of service that went beyond mere duty to encompass genuine devotion to the institution of monarchy. Jenny noticed her expression and moved closer. "Is everything all right, Miss Thompson?" Margaret showed her the invitation, watching as the young woman's eyes widened with excitement. "Oh, Miss Thompson, this is wonderful. You deserve this so much." Margaret folded the invitation carefully and placed it back in its envelope. "Jenny, do you know what I'm most proud of in all of this?" The young woman shook her head. "I'm proud that we showed it's possible to honor the past while serving the present. Queen Elizabeth's dress will inspire visitors for generations to come, and Queen Camilla has found her own path to elegance and respect." Everyone won in the end. As the exhibition doors opened for the day's first visitors, Margaret took her usual position near the entrance, ready to answer questions and share stories about the extraordinary woman whose wedding dress had taught them all about the difference between wearing history and preserving it. A young girl approached the display case with her grandmother, pointing excitedly at the dress's long train. "Grandmama, was the Queen really a princess when she wore this?" The elderly woman smiled. "Yes, darling. She was just a young woman in love, much like you might be someday." Margaret listened to this exchange with deep satisfaction. This was exactly what Queen Elizabeth would have wanted, her most treasured possession bringing joy and inspiration to ordinary people, telling the story of love and commitment that had defined her long and remarkable life. Outside the castle walls, the world continued to change at its relentless pace, but inside this special room, time stood still. The dress would remain here, safe and beautiful, carrying forward the memory of a wedding day that had changed the course of history. And Margaret Thompson, the Scottish girl who had devoted her life to serving the royal family, had played her own small but crucial part in ensuring that some things would always remain sacred.